Hello, and welcome to Argus's Way to Freight podcast. This is part two of a three-part podcast on the biofuels and biofuels freight markets. With me are biofuels freight reporter Leonard Fisher-Matthews and biofuels deputy editor Simone Bergen. Right, let's dive into it. Simone, it seems, according to Argus forecasts, the demand for HVO is going to rise substantially next year, whereas if you look at the FAME side of things, then the outlook is much more murky. What would you describe as the key drivers there?
So some of that has been self-regulation from the European biofuels market to avoid some of this product. I think there's some fear that with the UK having its own anti-dumping investigation going on, that there could be, pushback on possible circumvention of duties, etc., which has made people prefer a non-Chinese proof of sustainability. But it is something that is still a possibility, so can somewhat support flows continuing even when on paper it may not look like the financials make any sense.
So one thing that I've noticed is it seems, according to Argus's forecasts, that HVO particularly is going to rise. The demand for HVO is going to rise substantially next year. Whereas if you look at FAME, our forecast, it seems to be, there's nothing crazy happening there. What's the main driver behind that?
There are a few things that have recently been very supportive of next year for the biodiesel and HVO markets in Europe. And some of this comes back to what I was saying earlier about the renewable fuel tickets. So I guess the most obvious thing is just with a new year, mandate levels tend to increase. So biofuels mandates tend to be based on the calendar year. So come 2025, people just have a higher mandated level that they have to meet. The German Environment Ministry set out a proposal to change the way that their ticket market works. And this is how they track compliance of whether you have met your greenhouse gas savings mandate, is when you blend the biofuel into conventional fuel or when you supply it to the market. In case of a fuel like HVO that doesn't have to be blended, you generate a certain amount of tickets based on the greenhouse gas savings of that fuel. And those GHG savings are then counted up, at the end of the year to prove that you've met your required greenhouse gas reduction levels in a very simple sense. And Germany was an interesting market for this because, first of all, it's one of the biggest biofuels markets in Europe. So just it has major impact on overall European levels on its own. But the German market allowed you to carry over tickets that had been generated above the amount you needed, so excess ticket generation, into future compliance years. And for obligated parties, there wasn't a limit on how much you could carry over. So you could generate a huge excess of tickets, and people did generate a huge excess of tickets when they were buying cheap biodiesel in past years, or there wasn't much cheap HVO. It was mostly coming from biodiesel, but people were generating an excess of tickets. You generate twice the amount when you're using an advanced biodiesel, so made out of waste and residue feedstocks, that qualifies advanced in Germany. And what they've proposed is to basically start from scratch next year. So instead of carrying over your excess tickets from this year and all the ones accumulated from past years to next year, and really not needing to buy very much biofuels to meet your mandate, instead, in 2025 and 2026, the proposal is you'll start fresh. And so people will all of a sudden now need to be blending actual physical biofuels next year, is the expectation. And the way the proposal works is that all the excess you have from at this point isn't necessarily lost. You just carry it over into 2027. Although the market may look very different at that point, so it's not something to hang your hat on necessarily. But with that, there's expectations that demand will be much higher from the start of next year than people had basically been planning on. So it really shook up the plans for the European market, and as a result, we've seen an increase in demand already as soon as we came into the fourth quarter, when people were starting to, buy early to carry it into next year. And with that, wrapping back around to the beginning, there's the expectation that this would support HVO, particularly because HVO right now is much less expensive than it used to be. It tends to be made out of waste feedstocks, which can vary depending on, what type of HVO you're buying. But crop-based HVO is not very common. And in Germany, you can sell HVO at the pump. So you tend to get, it's a fairly efficient fuel to use for meeting your mandates, because it's also easier to work with. You can keep it in storage for much longer than you can FAME biodiesels. And so just people like it. It's got good optics as well. The fact that it is a fully drop-in fuel, and all of that could be supportive of HVO from next year, along with a few other policy changes throughout Europe, like Sweden increasing their own mandates after they'd reduced the level. Some of the other Nordic countries are increasing mandates. The Netherlands has limited the amount of tickets that you can carry over into the next year. And all of this has really revitalized the biodiesel market just in the past couple of weeks.
And interestingly, that's well, you'd expect that would boost demand next year, but in the short term, now we have a surplus of cheap tickets that you either hold on to till, in Germany's case, 2027, or you take advantage of now. So I think the other side, the flip side of that is right now it's very, very cheap to just buy some tickets rather than blend your fuel and create some tickets. So I think that might also explain in part why biodiesel demand is so low in Europe in the
Yeah.
short term, right?
We've seen quite a lot of activity in biodiesel, but I wouldn't say it's actually related to a demand increase for right now. I'd say right now demand is still, it's better than people thought it would be, but I think a lot of the trading activity has actually come from the fact that all of these changes really, again, shook up everybody's plans. Everybody's books were planned out for next year, and this made a big difference. And the immediate reaction we saw was a lot of activity on the paper market for Q4, as people were figuring out what kind of position they wanted to take through the end of the year. And it's an interesting one because you have competing forces on supply and demand here, because you're completely right that in Germany, there's no reason to blend any physical biofuels, for the rest of the year, because you need to use these tickets. They're really cheap. They're already available. You don't really need to generate any more unless you want to bring some cheaply into 2027. But again, that's a risky position to take. With Germany doing things like implementing Red 3, it could be a very different situation in 2027. So on one hand, that would be lowering demand, but people are also trying to buy while the fuel is still cheaper and then bring it into next year. So buy now before prices go up and then hold on to it to blend, early next year, generate tickets then. And there's a timing element here for biodiesel because biodiesel is only good for about 3 months once it's been turned into biodiesel. But feedstock you can hold on to for much longer. So we have also seen an increase in interest on the feedstock side as producers are starting to look at buying the feedstock cheaply now, holding on to it, and then producing when margins are expected to be much better at the start of next year. And all of these things pushing against each other essentially had people take really strong positions for Q4. And we don't know exactly what those positions are, of course, but we know based on the volume of paper that was trading that people have these very strong Q4 positions. And with that, even though we're still at a time where, maybe it doesn't make that much sense to hold on to FAME, for 3 months, maybe the quality would be still a bit questionable about whether you could make it into next year before you blend it. We're seeing people really picking up trading because they have these strong paper positions. So they're working these paper positions. And it's something that the market has, I would say, we had our industry event, the Argus Biofuels Conference in London. And last year, the sentiment was much more negative. People were really worried about the market. They were really worried about everything that was happening with these imports from Asia, with low prices, with questions of sustainability. This year, there's still a lot of questions. There are difficult production margins, but people seem much more optimistic than they were before. I would say it's not quite, nobody wants to be the first one to say that they're bullish, but the vibe is definitely leaning more that direction than we've seen for a long time. And so with that, we've been seeing a lot of trading that doesn't necessarily correspond to more imports, because really the demand is still ultimately linked to diesel demand. But we're seeing people, looking ahead at the next few months and getting ready for things to be a very different market than we have been seeing for the past year or two.
So people are gearing up for 2025. Interestingly, we haven't, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't really seen that reflected in European prices yet, right?
Um, it's varied a bit. We've seen a real rally in biodiesel prices just from the start of October, and that's really come from, the increase in liquidity, I think has been supportive, as well as the conflict in the Middle East was supporting biodiesel prices as the underlying ICE gas oil value rose. That's come off again a bit, and in response, we've also seen biodiesel prices come down some. You can see in the paper market people trading less Q4, Q1 now, but you can see people trading Q1 right when the Germany news first came out. We were seeing quite a steep contango between Q4 and Q1. That has flattened out some, I think, as people have started working their Q4 positions. I think it's flattened out that curve a little bit as people start looking forward to, maybe the last month of Q4. You'll be able to do a lot of your buying for Q1, etc. I think essentially now that people have had more time to respond, the curve has flattened some, but it has really varied as well. And the paper market always swings around a decent amount day to day. It tends to be more liquid than the physical market, so you do see that kind of volatility that comes from that. But it really does depend. Some of it is, of course, quality related. So Fame Zero, for example, we've been seeing, I believe, in a backwardation between Q4 and Q1, but that is typical for this time of year as well, because it's essentially the summer spec of biodiesel. So it's completely normal that in the winter there would be significantly less demand for Fame Zero as compared to something with better cold properties like RME.
Thank you, Simone. Fascinating stuff. I think we can stop here for today and pick this up in the final part of the podcast, where we will focus on the outlook for the market and drill down a bit into the SAF market. Thank you both for your time, and speak to you on the next podcast. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And if you want to learn more about Argus's biofuels freight coverage, then all of the details are on our website. We hope to see you again in the next Way to Freight. Goodbye.